This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
This episode is brought to you by Chevy Silverado. When it's time for you to ditch the blacktop and head off-road, do it in a truck that says no to nothing. The Chevy Silverado Trail Boss. Get the rugged capability of its Z71 suspension and 2-inch factory lift. Plus, impressive torque and towing capacity thanks to an available Duramax 3-liter turbo diesel engine. Where other trucks call it quits, you'll just be getting started. Visit Chevy.com to learn more.
Hey everyone, it's Lizzie. Just wanted to flag that, yes, we are following the blow-up between Elon Musk and President Trump, and as that story develops, we will be following it. But today's show is about someone in Washington you may not have heard of. Okay, here it is. Last week, reporter Nancy Scola sat in a federal courthouse in Washington listening to government lawyers talk about the best way to break up Google. A federal judge has already ruled that Google broke antitrust laws to maintain its search monopoly.
And now the government needs to do something about it. So both sides laid out their case. The Justice Department is pushing for some pretty aggressive measures. One of the things that the Justice Department is asking for is that Google actually has to sell off Chrome, which is its browser.
Google, not surprisingly, not a fan of that idea. While Nancy was in the courthouse, she was keeping an eye on one key player, Gail Slater, the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, a quiet but vital position in the Trump administration. Nancy wrote a profile of Slater for Politico magazine.
This is a make-or-break case for her. She's only a few months into the job. But this is, we sometimes talk about the trial of the century. This is a pretty big deal. This is a trial of the century in some way. She inherited the case from the Biden administration, which inherited the case from the Trump administration. But her name's on it.
Which Slater is clearly aware of. Here she is speaking to reporters in April.
The Google search case matters because nothing less than the future of the internet is at stake. Are we going to give Americans choices and allow innovation and competition to thrive online? Or will we maintain the status quo that favors big tech monopolies?
And if she succeeds in breaking up Google, the public will notice, the president will notice, and it could sort of enshrine her in the annals of antitrust history. So she's keeping pretty close tabs on it.
Today on the show, Gail Slater is one of the most important people in Washington who you've probably never heard of. And what she does now could change the internet forever. I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals, and here's a really smart one you can set. Earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this, Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously, all of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this show. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Agency. While single agents can handle specific tasks, the real power comes when specialized agents collaborate to solve complex problems. But there's a fundamental gap. There's no standardized infrastructure for these agents to discover, communicate with, and work alongside each other. That's where Agency comes in. The Agency is an open-source collective building the Internet of Agents, a global collaboration layer where AI agents can work together. It will connect systems across vendors and frameworks, solving the biggest problems of discoverability, interoperability, and scalability for enterprises. With contributors like Cisco, Crew AI, LangChain, and MongoDB, Agency is breaking down silos and building the future of interoperable AI. Shape the future of enterprise innovation. Visit agency.org to explore use cases now. That's agntcy.org. You know, I think Gail Slater is not a name that a lot of people would know, even if they follow the Trump administration pretty closely. Can you tell me a little bit about her background? Introduce me to Gail Slater.
So Gail Slater is well known in Washington, D.C. tech policy circles. She's a quiet, Irish-born lawyer known for her accent. She still retains her accent after all these years. She came up through the Federal Trade Commission as an in-the-trenches enforcement attorney and then a attorney advisor for a Democratic commissioner. Put in time at the Internet Association, which was the first big trade association for online companies in Washington, D.C., and so really just developed a ton of relationships around Washington on these issues.
It's important to note that when Slater was at the Internet Association, she was working on behalf of big tech. Then she joined the first Trump administration. At the time, she wasn't actually working on antitrust. Her focus was 5G, though she also contributed to First Lady Melania Trump's Be Best initiative, too. But what she witnessed during those years seems to have changed her outlook on big tech's power. In Washington, often you have principals and staffers, right? Staffers who get into the nitty-gritty. They know the law, they know the policy really well. And I would love to talk about her evolution from kind of staffer to principal. You know, she worked for the Internet Association. Do you think her attitudes around tech regulation shifted as she became more prominent? Do you think she is taking on the policy priorities of her boss?
I think both. I think a little bit there's the idea that Slater, like many folks on the right, saw the power of the tech companies during the first Trump administration. They look at some of the issues around COVID information and the content moderation policies of platforms like Twitter and Facebook. They look at January 6th, where President Trump had his account banned from Twitter and Facebook. They look at, again, with January 6th, Parler, which is a writer center social media platform that was used to organize some of the events of January 6th. And Parler was booted from the Apple Store and the Google App Store. And Gail Slater talked in her confirmation hearing about how she finds it frightening that people can be disappeared from the internet because we have a handful of dominant platforms that really can say, okay, you no longer can have an account on our platform. And their argument is then you're effectively silenced. They look at the company's willingness to do this to President Trump and say, this is evidence that they've grown too powerful. If they're willing to, quote unquote, silence the president of the United States, clearly they don't feel the pressure of other competitors in their markets, and therefore we need to apply antitrust enforcement action against them. It's interesting you mentioned this evolution from a staffer to a principal. In Trump's Washington, you sort of have to make that leap. You have to see yourself as a political figure making a lot of noise around your issues. It's not okay to be behind the scenes just working on the policy front. One of the things I found so fascinating was that after decades of being in Washington and not having much of a public profile, Assistant Attorney General Slater, 3 weeks into office, held an event at Justice Department headquarters, right? This hulking building that's the center of, the headquarters for the Department of Justice in Washington, called Big Tech Censorship. It was a forum bringing together what Slater called some of our most important MAGA influencers to discuss the behavior of these tech companies. So that's Steve Bannon, that's Benny Johnson, who's a conservative commentator. And so that was her really embracing the sort of Trump flavor of politics in a way that was frankly surprising to me as somebody who's covered these issues for a bit of time.
Yeah, that is not the move of someone who wants to fly under the radar and just kind of make the policy trains run.
Yeah, and she quoted what she said, the great Steve Bannon, who was at the event. She said, in the words of the great Steve Bannon, it's time for action, action, action. Very much a Trump approach to politics and policy.
I think that's so fascinating because in traditional Republican policy circles, that is not the way that antitrust was seen in the GOP.
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to write this profile, is because when President Trump came back into office, we didn't know. There was a scramble in Washington to help the president staff his administration with antitrust enforcers, and I help in the way of giving names. You know, you had the tech industry suggesting names, folks on Capitol Hill giving names, trying to get their school of thought on these issues staffed in the administration. And the anti-monopoly faction, which is what we call the sort of folks on both the right and the left who want more aggressive enforcement against tech companies in particular, they really won. They won at the Federal Trade Commission with Chair Andrew Ferguson, who's very aggressive on big tech, and they won at the Justice Department with Gail Slater.
So the thing about tech policy that has been so fascinating for, I would say, the last decade, though one could probably go back further to the former FTC Chair Lena Khan's time in law school, when she published a very famous article about this, is the anti-monopolist sentiment on both the left and the right. And I guess what I would like to interrogate with you is whether Gail Slater is looking at this from let's break up a monopoly, or you are being mean, big tech, and quote unquote censoring conservatives. Like, do you have a sense of where her thoughts lie?
In writing this profile, I really pressed on that point. Antitrust experts you talk to say you just don't bring cases saying company X has been mean to the president and therefore we need to break them up or apply these other remedies.
Because they're private companies. I mean, you might not like it, but they are private companies. They're not arms of the government.
The argument that folks on the right, like Assistant Attorney General Slater, Chair Andrew Ferguson of the FTC, is they are so powerful that they effectively, the ability that they have to remove people from their platforms, to not allow people's speech, means some of those rules are out the window. Some of what we talk about as, hey, they're just private companies and therefore it's a hands-off approach, they would look at that and say, that's failed. That approach has failed. And they still, what's interesting is Gail Slater in particular will say, we still believe in a free market, right? We haven't abandoned sort of these principles that we traditionally would associate with the right. The way that you have a free market is aggressively using this body of law that's been developed over a century and a half in the United States and break up monopolies. Now, to be clear, there's folks on the right and look at that and say, that's ridiculous. If we're free market folks, we're free market folks. We don't try to dictate how these companies behave. And in the Google case in particular, it's interesting because they are in some ways attempting to dictate how these companies behave, right? It's simply not spinning off the Google browser. It's also saying to Google, hey, all the search data you get, you have to share with OpenAI, Perplexity, these other AI companies. That is really sort of, sticking your hands into the machinery of the free market.
Yeah.
And they've won. That argument that, hey, it's okay for Republicans and it's okay to conservatives to tell businesses in detail how to behave. Right now in Washington, that's the argument that's winning.
There were some conservatives, notably J.D. Vance, who were fans of Lena Khan, the chair of the Biden FTC. Are there people on the left who are Gail Slater fans?
Absolutely. For this profile, I spoke with Luther Lowe, who was for a long time an official at Yelp, who is attempting to get action taken against Google on the argument that Google had treated Yelp unfairly and stymied its development. Gail Slater came up through the Federal Trade Commission, and Luther Lowe describes meeting with her 10 years ago, complaining about Google, and her being one of the few voices inside the agency who listened. She was skeptical of these companies even back then when nobody was skeptical of these companies. And it won her a lot of fans. She's quietly behind the scenes, made her opinions clear to some of these folks. And so they were thrilled. Luther Lowe, I quote him in that piece, says, I'm a Democrat. But to have somebody on the right side of history and power now, they're absolutely thrilled by it. And they look at a Trump administration and say, this could have gone very differently. The applauding that you heard on the anti-monopoly left when Gail Slater was picked was pretty loud.
When we come back, Gail Slater's biggest challenge, her boss, and his love of posting. If you're running a business, you know how important it is to stay connected to your customers, and having a flexible and efficient phone system is essential to succeed. Introducing OpenPhone, the #1 business phone system that streamlines and scales your customer communications. OpenPhone works through an app on your phone or computer, and your team can share one number and collaborate on customer calls and texts like a shared inbox. That way, any teammate can pick right up where the last person left off, keeping response times faster than ever. Plus, with AI-powered call transcripts and summaries, you'll be able to automate follow-ups, ensuring you'll never miss a customer interaction again. So whether you're a one-person operation or have a large team that needs better collaboration tools, check out OpenPhone. See why over 50,000 businesses trust OpenPhone to manage their business's calls and texts. OpenPhone is offering TBD listeners 20% off of your first 6 months at openphone.com/TBD. That's OPENPHONE.com/TBD. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone. No missed calls, no missed customers.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game, shifting a little money here, a little there, just hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill, too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
I think you're on mute.
Workday starting to sound the same?
I think you're on mute.
Find something that sounds better for your career on LinkedIn. With LinkedIn Job Collections, you can browse curated collections by relevant industries and benefits, like flex PTO or hybrid workplaces, so you can find the right job for you. Get started at linkedin.com/jobs. Finding where you fit. LinkedIn knows how.
So I think one of the things that might get in Gail Slater's way, which you wrote about this, is the president himself. Because let's say you're trying to put forth a large, careful case and saying this is about systemic stuff. This is not about, individual animus from one person toward a company. And then all of a sudden, the president comes along and posts, they are wrong and bad, or this CEO is terrible. Like, how does she deal with that?
It is enormously difficult. It's what makes her job very hard. In the first Trump administration, he did this. He railed against CNN. The Justice Department at that time tried to block a merger of AT&T and Time Warner, which at the time owned CNN. And folks close to the president, like Rudy Giuliani, said, oh, yeah, we're attempting to block this merger because the president doesn't like CNN.
Right. They said the quiet part out loud.
They said the quiet part out loud. Now, the question is, has he learned? Right. He did this also during the first term on his ban of people traveling from predominantly Muslim countries. The courts looked at that. They said, his lawyer said this isn't based on race or religion. And then Trump would tweet things that made clear it was based on race or religion. Has he learned to not make those beliefs clear when it could imperil the cases his administration are bringing? We don't know yet. We do know, though, he's very invested in these issues. He posted on Truth Social when he nominated Gail Slater saying, big tech has run wild for years. Gail's going to take care of it. He personally looks at these companies and thinks these are powerful entities that tried to beat me. They lost, and we're taking the thinking is he's feeling like he can take a little bit of revenge. If he says that out loud, it's not great for her. It's not great for her. That judges don't tend to enjoy that.
Well, yeah, I mean, she has said she doesn't believe that President Trump would ask her to target a company for political reasons. But then if you look over at, say, the FCC and what Brendan Carr is doing there, the current chair, or if you, I mean, mostly like the case against 60 Minutes, all of those things, those read very clearly as, I don't like you, you're a target, we're coming after you, and using the power of the state to do that.
Absolutely, which becomes all the more problematic when you're a law enforcement agency, as the Justice Department is, right? It's a little bit different than launching an investigation, passing some rulemaking, that sort of thing. She's using the full powers of the Justice Department against these companies. It can be very problematic when it looks like the president's dictating, go after my political enemies.
Well, so what do judges then make of that? Like, does it weaken her arguments in front of a judge, or her staff's arguments in front of a judge? Is there a way that the Justice Department will try to thread this needle? Like, I'm just trying to figure out how they do that in these huge, consequential, multi-billion-dollar cases.
The somewhat wonderful thing for her, from her perspective, I would imagine, is that the Google case was brought by the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, at a time when President Trump was talking about how mean Google had been to him, but it was continued by the Biden administration. So that buys her a ton of cover, right? A judge can look at this and say, this is a bipartisan case. You know, the Biden administration ran with it. They pursued it pretty aggressively. The challenge for her becomes when she brings her next cases, the cases she starts from scratch. Does a judge look at that and say, this is politically motivated? And people in antitrust, you probably well know this, talk about judges. Judges don't like these cases anyway. Antitrust is obscure, complicated, boring, a lot of moneyed interest trying to get you do this or that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but antitrust judges tend to be in many ways more small c conservative than kind of the modern antitrust movements.
Well, it's a little bit frightening if you can think about being a judge and breaking up Google, right? Or taking some of, you can make your name on it, but it's also a big step to take with huge consequences. So they do tend to be more conservative on the economics of it, right? To sort of embrace what we used to call the antitrust consensus, that you know, and if a company was offering low cost, no cost products, you kind of left them alone. Judges. That was nice for judges because they didn't have to sort of go mucking around in these industries. And so if they look at this and say, this is a political case, I'm already prone not to want to take some of these aggressive antitrust actions, I'll just back away from it. That's hard for her then. That creates a lot of difficulty of actually getting these cases over the line.
In the past, we saw several of what I would describe as the more muscular cases brought by the Biden administration fail in court. Some of them did not go that far. Where do you think this ends up shaking out? Like, are we going to have the last word on these big cases while Gail Slater is in charge of this part of the antitrust division? Or is this going to be something that gets kicked upwards?
We're in year 6 of the Google search case, and Google has already promised to appeal. So I think it's possible we see the Google search case in particular resolved during Gail Slater's tenure. It's also possible not. Other cases she may well bring and then hand off to her successor.
The Google case is not the only big case that Slater has on her plate. There's a case against Apple over monopoly in smartphones. She might be involved in the FTC's case against Meta over its acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp. What are you watching for as someone who's been following her closely to sort of figure out where antitrust policy is going?
One of the things you sometimes see in antitrust is there's some novel theories that people use to discuss cases. When they actually file them, they're pretty old school antitrust lawsuits. What I'm looking to see from Gail Slater is the cases brought by her division is she advancing new theories about what antitrust enforcement is or isn't? Is speech actually an antitrust concern? FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson has said, absolutely, speech is an antitrust concern. Does she actually put that in briefings to the court? I'm very much waiting to see if that's the case. The other thing is simply the targets she picks. You mentioned the Apple case. There's a big case against Live Nation Ticketmaster. Who does she go after next? That's, in some ways it's very sort of simple. It's, you have to tee up targets of these lawsuits and who they've limited resources. Who does she choose to direct those resources at?
And what will that tell you?
If the old way of thinking, quote unquote, old way of thinking about antitrust in Washington, in the legal community, that mostly the concern of antitrust is, are consumers getting products for low costs? We saw a deviation from that during the Biden administration. Silicon Valley, other folks in other industries have very much wanted to return to that norm.
And threw in a lot of money and support behind the Trump administration.
Yeah. So I guess the thing that I'm looking for is on two fronts. The tech company really did, as President Trump say, run wild, at least in Washington, and having their way in dictating policy and how government treated them. Are those days really, truly over? Or was the Biden administration something of an interregnum? Is that, they had a bad couple of years, but we're going back to business as usual. So that's on the sort of tech industry role in Washington, keeping an eye on that. On the antitrust front, is it what was traditionally antitrust concerns? Is only businesses really sort of raising prices on consumers, behaving in really unacceptable anti-competitive ways that gets antitrust enforcers' attention? That's the way it was for many years. Or is it the aperture widened? The Biden administration really widened the aperture. What we think of as antitrust concerns is a whole range of different potentially problematic behaviors. Do we narrow the aperture back to the way it was the 80s through the Obama administration? Or do regulators, lawmakers, antitrust enforcers say, we were looking at things too narrowly back then. We've now seen the light. We've now see all these behaviors as potentially of concern of government, and we're not going back to the way things were.
It has not escaped probably anyone's attention that the CEOs of some of the biggest tech companies in America donated a lot of money to either the Trump inauguration or to the campaign, came to the inauguration, sat there, lots of photos of them. Are they getting what they want out of Washington and out of antitrust policy? Because they did a lot of complaining during the Biden administration.
What they want from Washington is a whole range of things. Whether they get what they want on trade policy, on AI, seems like potentially, yeah. On antitrust, it seems a little bit different. It seems like they're not going to get their way at the Federal Trade Commission or at the Department of Justice. The challenge is they do have so many interests now, right? These are not single issue companies in the way that they might be in other industries. They have their finger in so many different regulatory and law enforcement questions. So how those issues play out, you kind of really have to keep a scorecard. Like we won't know until 4 years, at the end of 4 years, whether they won more than they lost. On the tech CEO question, sitting at the inauguration, just as an aside, I don't know if it's useful, but I spoke to someone on background who's central figure in the Trump world, very close with Gail Slater, who said everyone looked at the tech CEOs at the inauguration and thought, oh, they're being given, this is an honor. They're being given pride of place, right? They sort of won.
Yeah.
And after 4 years in Biden's Washington, where they felt like they were kind of just trampled on day in and day out. And this person said, you're seeing it all wrong. These are heads on a pike. President Trump looks at these CEOs and founders, billionaires many times over, and says, you put everything you had into keeping me from this moment, keeping me from being sworn in again, and I won. And he wanted to make a show of it. And in some way, that understanding of the political dynamic between President Trump and the tech industry is defining how Washington approaches these companies. You had all this political power. You use it to keep us from coming back, keeping us from being in power again. You lost. There will be some payback.
Nancy Scola, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thanks for having me.
Nancy Scola is a contributing writer at Politico magazine. She covers the intersection of technology and society. And that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Evan Campbell. Our show is edited by Elena Schwartz. TBD is part of the larger What Next family. And if you like what you heard today, the best way to support our independent journalism is to join Slate Plus. Just head on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. All right, we'll be back with more episodes next week. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks so much for listening.